Welcome to this week's Military Collectors, folks. We're back here in Vincennes, Indiana, in the heartland of America, at the Indiana Military Museum. All of these great artifacts that you see behind me are from the personal collection of Jim Osborne, resident, lifelong collector. And now this week we're going to showcase what Jim has put together as the Indiana Military Museum right here on Military Collectors. From planes to ships, you name it, he's got it. He's collected it. He's had that vision, that passion since he was 7 years old. A man who, from 1945, a World War II baby, has collected his whole life, and it's all right here in Vincennes, Indiana, at the Indiana Military Museum on this week's Military Collectors.
31, ready to check. Roger that.
Folks, welcome to this week's Military Collectors. We are so honored, and it's just a pleasure to be in the heartland right here in Indiana. Vincennes, the Indiana Military Museum, and the guy that put this all together, his lifelong collection, as we are going to showcase this week on Military Collectors, is none other than the Honorable Jim Osborne. Jim, I am so honored to be here because, you know, this is probably the most extensive personal collection that our TV production and me personally has ever seen. I've been to a lot of museums. I've been to a lot of places around the country, okay? And I'm not only former military, but I'm a history buff like you. But putting together a personal collection like this had to be a tremendous, a piece of satisfaction that nobody else could ever imagine.
It's been an enjoyable trip, Bob. Yeah, from day one, and I started when I was 7 years old, as you know. So, I've had a lot of years to accumulate this.
Well, let's go back just a little bit here, okay? I mean, there's probably well over 200,000 pieces of artifacts here, from all the way to the beginning of the very first conflict that the United States had to up current day Afghanistan and of course the war on terrorism. But tell me about, as a young 7-year-old boy, what got this started?
I know what got it started was that my father gave me a Civil War musket that someone owed him a little bit of money, so they gave him this musket. And when he brought it home, that musket stood much taller than I was, but I was just fascinated with that. And then the second thing I can remember just shortly after that was the next door neighbor, a veteran of World War II, was going to the trash pit with items he'd brought back from the War of Germany, helmet, flag, canteen, and so forth. And he handed them to me, so that was my initial voyage just starting right there.
Well, I mean, you, of course, growing up here in the heartland of the United States, right here in farming country, Vincennes, Indiana. I mean, it must have been very, very special to start going to places to find these artifacts. I mean, even as a youngster.
Well, as a youngster, it was pretty easy because it was just right after World War II, and so these guys were, parting with this stuff pretty quick. The wives were saying, "Get it out of the house." And so for a long time, I was just, pick it up and haul it home. And before long, I had a pretty good stack in the basement before my parents even realized it was there.
Well, your folks must have been very understanding. Of course, you know how moms are, okay, when you start dragging stuff home. Where did you put all of it?
Well, of course, luckily they had a good full-size basement, so that was the start, some in the garage. And what's interesting is that occasionally my mother would even come home with something from a rummage sale because she knew I was interested. So.
Wow. Now, moving forward a little bit, of course, with those collections, everybody has their most prized and most favorite. And there is just so much here. And folks, I have to tell you, you need to log on to militarycollectorstv.com and you'll find, again, the website here for the Indiana Military Museum, because you need to come visit this place. I mean, history lives here, and it's all through this guy's personal collection that you're going to be able to do that. But, Jim, you have certain items, I know. What is one of your premier that kind of sticks out?
Well, I think that a couple of the most outstanding pieces we've got are World War II. We've got Eisenhower's full Class A uniform. It was tailor-made in London just a few months before D-Day. And we've got a couple of Patton's uniforms. We got his tanker's jacket that he wore during World War II. We've got Bob Morgan's uniform. It's the only one in existence. Bob Morgan, of course, was the pilot of the Memphis Belle, the famous plane that the B-17 that made the first 25 missions successfully over Europe. And so we have the one and only uniform of Bob Morgan's. And so I think those are premier pieces that I'm really proud of that we have.
Well, let me ask you, let's go a little earlier, okay? You've got this musket as a 7-year-old boy, and so you're collecting stuff pre-Civil War and that sort of thing. Now we're talking the cavalry, okay? I notice there's a certain box in there that houses a lot of Custer stuff. You know, how important is that to your collection?
Some interesting items from the Indian War period. Yes, we have a coverlet that was knitted by Elizabeth Custer for a good friend of Custer's, Peter Boehm. And Peter Boehm's great-grandson lives here in Vincennes. Peter Boehm won the Medal of Honor riding with Custer in the Civil War, which we have that on display along with the Medal of Honor he won. And also one of the survivors of Little Bighorn that rode with Benteen instead of Custer during the Battle of Little Bighorn was from Vincennes, Jacob Adams. And we have some artifacts pertaining to Jacob Adams here. And the other interesting thing is we have a cemetery, of course, as you've noticed, right across the road. And that's where Jacob Adams is buried today. So Indian War history here too.
I'm just so amazed at this collection, and because again, you touched it all, and I think that's what's so special. There are just not many men who have that passion, or many individuals that I know. It's a mini Smithsonian here. Again, that's what makes it so unique, is because you've taken that personal time to reach out to generals, to former veterans and stuff like that. I mean, how many letters did you write in order to reach out to these folks?
I've lost track, but I'm sure thousands.
Wow. I mean, and even from General Haig's collection in there, I mean, that's a special story in itself. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how did you get all of Haig's items?
Well, in that instance, General Haig's brother-in-law was a good friend of ours and was serving on our board of directors. So when General Haig passed away, he contacted his sister to see what might be available for the museum, and that's how it came about.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I tell you what, there's so much here to look at. We just can't get it all right here in this first segment. It's so special. But hold that thought, because I got some other questions that we're going to ask you when we come back, because you had some travels in your lifetime, and I know they were important. So, folks, when we come back here on Military Collectors, Jim is going to talk to you about some of his travels over to Europe over his lifetime that not only added to his collection, but also his curiosity about World War II.
31, ready to check. Roger that.
Welcome back to Military Collectors. As promised, I have Jim Osborne, premier collector right here in Vincennes, Indiana. And I've got Jim, I've got him keyed up to talk about not only his passion for collection, but his passion for history and World War II. And Jim, during your travels, now, of course, being an attorney, and being a history major and even a teacher for several years, your history took you to Germany. Tell me about your first trip in the 80s to Germany.
Well, actually, my first trip was back in '65.
In '65,
yeah,
okay.
I started making trips in '65. I mean, by 1980, there had been a few more trips. But I made trips back over, I guess I've 20 times or more. But the purpose was several times was just to meet with various World War II veterans and people, both for the British, German, and so forth, that I had corresponded with and got to know. And so a lot of those trips were to culminate those friendships and talk a little bit.
Well, let's talk about 1982 now. You're a young man, you're already an established lawyer. you go to Berchtesgaden, and right there, tell us a little bit about that trip that year.
Well, one of our stops on that trip was we were hitting a lot of historic spots, that pertain to World War II. And so we went to Berchtesgaden, and of course we knew that Hitler's Berghof, his house that was up in the Alps there, where it had been located, had been bombed and of course blown up, completely up in 1952 by the German government. But we decided we'd go up and see what was left. And surprisingly, we found out that there was still some left, and we found out there was still underground rooms there and so forth. So we planned a second trip the next year to go back and get into those rooms, which we did. And we discovered several underground rooms there underneath the main level of the house, and roamed through there and found a few artifacts, and it was interesting.
Well, one of those prized artifacts, tell me, what mostly stuck out at you that you brought back? Well,
in the big room where the picture window used to be, you could see the mechanism where the picture window went up above, and it would drop down and be an open air.
Now that was the big curved window?
There was a big, huge rectangular window that was probably 40 foot long, maybe, that they could make this whole room open air.
So that was the famous picture where Hitler would be out on the balcony there with his generals.
Yeah, they could overlook the balcony and overlook the Alps and so forth. So the mechanism was still down in this basement area. So we saw that. And right there in that room was a big porcelain drain, which I was able to pull out of the floor and as a souvenir, of course, and brought that back along with other minor things,
oh my goodness,
like old light switches and things that were still down there in the basement, some Meissen tile that was on the wall. And that's, as you know, since then they've gone back and sealed all of this up, so there's no chance to get in there now. But I wrote a story for After the Battle magazine at that time, and then of course I received letters from all over the world from people saying, "How did you get in there? Tell us how you do this." So that might have had something to do with them sealing it up.
They probably were reading it too. Well, let's take another aspect here of history. You have contacts, and of course, part of your collection here from former general officers who now many have passed on from World War II, but you were able to go back to Germany, and you were able to have another trip there with a specific reason. Tell all the folks out there what that trip was about.
Well, I think you're talking about the visit with Albert Speer.
Yes.
And when I was in law school, I was writing a paper on the Nuremberg trials, doing some research, and so I decided I'd try to contact some of these former defendants that were at Nuremberg, Speer and Donitz and a few others. And surprisingly, I heard from them, and so I had developed a dialogue with some of them and continued that after law school. And so ultimately I got an invitation from Speer one time to come and see him. If I'm in Germany, come and see him. So I thought I better jump on that opportunity. That's going to be a kind of a chance of a lifetime historical experience to talk to someone like that. So I did, and I made a trip to Heidelberg and visited with Speer and his home for one afternoon, and so I answered lots of questions, asked lots of questions, and learned a little bit more about the trials from his standpoint.
Well, what folks may or may not know, being history buffs, as you wrote in many articles after you came home. One particular was he was in charge of all the munitions and basically the German industrial complex that powered the war.
Yeah. He started out, of course, as Hitler's architect.
Right.
And then, when the war started and the vacancy came for the Minister of Armaments, he filled that position and then filled that to the remainder of the war. And so he turned his engineering abilities over to that. And so he wrote a book, as you know, Inside the Third Reich, which he wrote during the time he was in prison at Spandau. And that became a bestseller, and of course a very interesting inside look, and hence the name Inside the Third Reich. Very interesting and probably a historically significant book. So,
well, let me ask you one question. Did he have any regrets when you had the chance to interview him, or was he still vibrant and that in his own mind that he was right?
No, I think he was recalcitrant, if nothing else, and it's interesting that, of course, and it certainly played to his favor. He was one of the only ones there at the major trial in Nuremberg that admitted guilt. That may have been a very smart move on his part because he got 20 years instead of life or death.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, he didn't seem to be a fervent Nazi when I talked to him. I mean, he didn't espouse anything in that nature, and so I mean, other than that, how can I say? I don't know.
Right. Well, Jim, it's such a remarkable career of collecting. We've got more to show the folks on this week's Military Collectors, and so with that, stand by because I've got some other great questions I want to ask you. But folks, when we come back, we're going to be talking to Jim Osborne right here in Vincennes, Indiana, at the Indiana Military Museum about some of his more, well, let's just say, unique collections. Welcome back to Military Collectors. We're here at Vincennes, Indiana at one of the premier collections by any personal individual. As I've told you throughout the show, Jim Osborne, who put all of this wonderful place, he now calls the Indiana Military Museum right here in downtown Vincennes. But we're going to talk a little bit about wheeled vehicles and his collection on that side of things. We've talked about the eaches and uniforms and special items there, but you know, Jim, let's talk a little bit about the rolling stock, okay? Mm-hmm. What was your first, well, really, as a young man, what was your first one?
Well, in college, I was able to pick up a Jeep, a World War II Jeep, and a farmer here locally had it, and I was able to purchase that pretty reasonably, and so I still have that. It's over in the other building.
Well, you know, World War II Jeeps were plentiful. There were a lot of them made, yeah. And a lot of folks have them. Everything is drying up now as far as, you know, when we're moving off into that to the history. But what was the second item that you actually got?
Well, after the Jeep, it wasn't too much longer. Then I thought, well, you know, we need something a little more exciting, so we found a half track, and so we went down to southern parts in Memphis, Tennessee, who had several that they sold at that time to contractors and so forth, but they had bought them from the National Guard. The National Guard had parted with them, so we bought us a nice World War II half-track.
Well, you know, from a guy that started out with small armaments, a musket, then you move to artillery pieces, okay? Now you're moving from half-tracks.
The next thing was a tank.
It was tanks, okay? Yeah. Well, tell us about your armor collection.
Well, we've got a nice variety of armor. We've got the Sherman, and we've got the couple of versions of the Stuart tanks, and we've got some self-propelled guns on Sherman chassis, and then there's some Japanese tanks here. We have a Russian T-34 here, and then we have a very rare chassis we just acquired of a Marmon Harrington tank, which was made before World War II. Marmon Harrington was trying to get into the government contract business and building tanks, but they weren't very successful, so it's an extremely rare tank. It's missing the turret, so we're going to have to replicate the turret again, but that's going to be a project we're looking forward to, because it's going to be an exciting addition to the museum.
Well, I think one of the tributes to you personally here, again, amassing a collection, that's one thing, but the displays, the vision, and all of that you put behind it, much like this behind us, with this burned out, looks like an old chapel of some sort from Europe.
It's like a Normandy church that's been heavily bombed, yes.
Yeah, and so you've got those. You've got outside displays that you put together out there in order to authenticate it. Now, I know a special heart goes out to all the kids that you bring through here every year throughout Indiana and the Midwest. But how about the big kids? Are they in awe when they come in here and see your collection?
Well, I think they are. I think everything from the young students all the way up through the grades, and then the older boys, you know, that really have been just like myself, that, you know, had to have something besides the model plane and the model tank. They've had to get a hold of the real deal, and of course a lot of people come through like that, and they're really excited about seeing something full scale.
Well, finally, I have to ask you about one special thing. And when you walk the grounds of your collection and you see the big stuff on the outside, there's one thing that sticks out, and that's the submarine. Tell me a little bit about, because, you know, other than probably the Navy folk at either coast in a museum of naval warfare or whatever, tell us about that submarine that's out here.
Yeah, when you drive in, you'll see the conning tower, and of course the hull stretching out in front of it of the USS Indianapolis 697, which was a nuclear powered attack submarine that was commissioned back in about 1980. and was decommissioned about 1998. So it had a short life, mostly because it was decommissioned early to accommodate some of the reciprocal acts from the Russians of decommissioning some of theirs. So we're real happy to add that to our exhibits. It was a 6-year process of getting that from the Navy in here and rebuilding the exhibit as you see it, which looks like a surfacing sub as you come in the drive.
Well, there's just not many museums that have the variety of things that you have amassed in your personal collection. And I just tell you, when the men and women of the armed forces and when the family members of all those that have served and come and gone and will serve come by here to see your collection, I know you're going to be smiling every day. And just the satisfaction.
What makes us happy are the comments we get from the visitors that come here. And they're very satisfied and they're mostly amazed at what they see. They don't expect it. And I think that pays off. It pays off to me personally when I hear that, and of course I know it does to all the volunteers that are here that work on these things. When they hear the praise that people give about how nice the collection is and how well it's presented, that's the pat on the back they need to keep going.
Well, Jim, I personally want to thank you so much for having our show here, and it's just been an honor and a privilege. It's just been one of those special things for me as a former veteran myself to come here and see what you've put together for not only yourself but for those others to come behind us to remember history, remember where this country has come from.
Thanks. What you said reminds me of something that I think a good friend of mine who's now passed away, Fred Ropke, who was a premier collector of these type of items. And the thing was, he always said, and I agree with completely, is that we're only the custodian of these items. We're not the owners. And what we'll be judged on is how well we've preserved them for the next generation. And so that's the way we look at it here. You know, we're just taking care of these for a short time until somebody else takes over.
If you have missed any past episodes of Military Collectors, be sure to go online at militarycollectorstv.com.
Well, next week, Military Collectors is going to come back with part 2 of our series here in Vincennes, Indiana, and we're going to showcase some special members of what Jim has put together as a corporation to help preserve his legacy and all of his collection. The Indiana Military Museum will be showcased next week, right back here on Military Collectors.